that. Very good. Well, a very, very warm welcome to what promises to be a most delightful and informative event tonight. As some of you may know, I'm the founding director of a project called Insiders Outsiders, which was fun. When was it? 2017, Anna? I think it's actually already a surprising
2019.
It took place. It was an idea I had in
the idea,
2017, and it took the form of a nationwide year-long arts festival, but basically designed to celebrate and indeed analyze in more depth and in a more nuanced sort of way the tremendously rich contribution in many, many different fields across the arts made by refugees from Nazi Europe to this country's culture. And as part of its rich afterlife is this series of mostly online events, obviously prompted by COVID, but I think a good way to proceed in many respects, of which this event tonight obviously forms part, a tribute to those who did contribute so much across the visual arts in this particular instance. Good, so I'm going to just actually sort of step back in a minute and hand over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Anna Nyberg, who will in turn introduce our main speaker, Lisa Mason, the curator of the wonderful Bernat Klein exhibition currently on at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, as many of you will know, until the 23rd of April. Is that right, Lisa? Plenty of time to see it still. So let me start by introducing Anna, if I may. I again suspect that many of you will know her and her achievements, very much relevant to today's topic. She's an honorary lecturer at Imperial College London, where she had taught languages for over 30 years. But more directly relevant is the fact that she's a committee member of the so-called Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, based at the University of London, and also a trustee, fairly recently appointed trustee of the Insiders Outsiders Arts Foundation. She's the author of a biography of one particular émigré artist, interesting man called Helmut Weissenborn, a book on the émigré contribution to British art publishing, really an excellent read, and yet another on the refugees' contribution to British fashion. Two of her essays on the design front appeared in the companion volume to the Insiders Outsiders Festival, which has the rather long-winded title of Insiders Outsiders, Refugees from Nazi Europe and Their Contribution to British Visual Culture, which is available, and I can't resist adding that there is a 20% discount on the cover price available. I can tell you right now, it's the code to type in at the checkout of the Lund Humphreys website is Insiders20, but in fact, if you go to the Insiders Outsiders Festival homepage, you'll get the details there as well. Also very pertinently to today, and in fact the film is being shown on the 4th of March, am I right? Yes, 4th of March in Edinburgh in an in-person event. She's co-produced a wonderful film, which again, some of you may have had the pleasure of watching, about refugee designers to this country called Refuge Britain. So I think without further ado, let me hand over to Anna and welcome everybody.
Thank you very much, Monica. Should I just add that we are recording tonight's talk?
Yes, please do. And usual protocol. I think you all know the ropes by now. Keep yourselves muted, please, if you would. If you don't want to be seen, then obviously turn off your cameras. And of course, there will be a chance to ask questions. I think in the first instance, type any questions or comments you may have in the chat, and we'll sort of take it from there towards the end of the session. Good.
Okay, lovely. Well, it's a really great honor to introduce Lisa Mason. Our paths have crossed a few times in our shared research interests. For example, both looking into Tibor Reich, who I think I'm right in saying was one of Bernat Klein's friends, a close friend. We also met up in Prague at a conference on the Ashes, yet more émigré, wonderful, wonderful textile designers. And more recently, the Museum of London, some of you may know, are planning to do a terrific exhibition at the Docklands branch of the Museum of London on Jewish clothes makers. So we've, our paths have crossed, as I said, quite a few times. And I, for one, am hugely looking forward to this talk tonight. I have waited 3 years for the Bernat Klein exhibition because of COVID. We were struck down 3 times in a row, but at last the show must go on, and it will. So Lisa is Assistant Curator of Modern and Contemporary Design at National Museum Scotland. She is Chair of the Dress and Textile Specialists and a Trustee of the Bernat Klein Foundation. Her research interests include textile design in post-war Britain, modern tapestry and design archives. Her recent projects include Archie Brennan, Tapestry Goes Pop at Dovecot Studios in Edinburgh in 2021, and relevant to tonight, of course, Bernat Klein, Design in Colour, currently on show, as Monica has just said, at the National Museum of Scotland. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Anna and Monica, for inviting me and for that kind introduction. I will now attempt to share my screen. One second. This is always like the scary bit. Hey, there we are. Okay, can everyone see?
Oh, good. No, that's perfect, I think. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so this evening I'm going to talk to you all about a really fascinating creative practitioner, educator and theorist who was displaced by the Second World War and made his home in the Scottish borders. In a career spanning approximately 4 decades, Bernat Klein produced textiles for the couture and ready-to-wear markets and realised a number of important interior design commissions, among many other things. Now, I think it's fair to say that Bernat Klein is not a household name, although I am trying very hard to rectify that. So I'm going to kind of spend a wee bit of time just introducing his life and work and attempting to situate his practice within the wider context of émigré designers practicing in post-war Britain. So this is a wee view of the photogenic section of the Bernat Klein collection and archive. So all these beautiful Tyvek bags and labels have been made by our wonderful museum volunteers. So the museum, the National Museum in Scotland, that is, in Edinburgh, acquired Bernat Klein's collection and archive in 2010. It comprises about 4,000 objects, and this includes paintings, garments, textiles, tapestries, press cuttings, design development tools made by Bernat himself, as well as other kind of more ephemeral, kind of slightly strange objects. And this resource forms the foundation of the exhibition currently on show at NMS, and the majority of the images and objects I'll draw upon in tonight's presentation come from this archive. So Bernat Klein was born in a small town called Senta, which is now part of modern-day Serbia, although it was the Kingdom of Yugoslavia when he was born there. His family, we can see them on screen, were textile retailers and wholesalers, and the business operated under the name Klein Liepot Textile Merchant, named after Klein's father. The shop, managed by Liepot and Klein's mother Zori, was located in the same street as their house, and Klein really grew up surrounded by fabrics and very much immersed in the industry. A very early influence on the young Bernat's ideas around personal style came from his mother Zori, who take really great care to dress her family. And Bernat talks about his mum in his autobiography, Eye for Colour, and the fact that she would really look in detail at textiles and had a very good eye for cloth and would select things that she thought would make her family look their best and have suits tailored for them. So you can see Bernat on the right and his brother Moshe on the left looking extremely dapper in their little tiny three-piece suits. And I should also say that Bernat Klein's daughter, Shelley, published a book called The See-Through House in 2019. It was just pre-pandemic, I can't remember the exact date, but it's partly about Shelley taking care of her father in his latter years, but it goes into quite a lot of detail about his early life. So that's a really interesting read if anyone is more interested in the kind of family history side of things. So as a young man, Bernat relocated to Jerusalem to study in a yeshiva with a leading rabbi. However, he left behind his religious education and enrolled at the famous Bezalel School of Arts and Crafts in Jerusalem. As a result of this decision to study in Jerusalem, he escaped the spread of Nazism across Eastern Europe, which would claim the lives of his family in the concentration camps. So Bernat just happened to be in Jerusalem when the Axis invasion of Yugoslavia took place. A very fortunate set of circumstances for him. Now, at the Basel School of Art and Design, Klein was taught by a painter called Mordecai Ardon. And Ardon was an alumnus of the Bauhaus School of Art and Design, whom you will all probably quite familiar with after all the kind of insiders, outsiders events. So Ardon introduced Klein to modern arts, including the works of artists such as Paul Klee and Cézanne. Bernat was also exposed as a young man to modern architecture during his time in Israel, which would have a really profound influence on him, as we shall see. So we don't actually in the archive have any documentary evidence from Klein's time in Israel, and it's something that I've always really wanted to do a bit more research into, with the kind of education, the curriculum at the Basel, but I've not really had the time or opportunity to do that thus far. But I think that it's safe to speculate that Bernat would have had at least some teaching on the fundamentals of colour theory whilst he was studying at the Basel, because of course this was a really, really key component of the Bauhaus curriculum, encouraged by practitioner theories such as Joseph Albers, Vasily Kandinsky and Johannes Itten. Displaced by the Axis invasion of his country of birth, Klein travelled to Leeds to study textile technology in 1945. And he would go on to spend the rest of his life in the UK, becoming a naturalised citizen in 1950. It was while he was studying at Leeds that Klein would meet his future wife, Margaret Soper, who would go on to become Klein's lifelong business partner and collaborator. And we'll hear a wee bit more about Margaret's design activities later. Now, of course, Leeds is a historic centre of woolen textile production, and this course really equips Bernat with a deep knowledge of the fundamental components of textile design and manufacture that would ultimately allow him to start his own business. So Klein he benefited much like Tibor Reich, who Anna mentioned earlier, had this really interesting combination of a kind of European modernist education and therefore bringing new ideas and visual languages to Britain, and also this kind of quite thorough grounding in the nuts and bolts of textile manufacture. Those two components were actually incredibly advantageous to him when he was starting out his career. So we can see on the screen a page from Klein's 1948 project book from Leeds. And this kind of demonstrates a burgeoning fascination with colour. So these two samples, they are painted paper painted with gouache, and the colours are derived from looking really, really closely at seashells. So already as a young man, we're seeing how Klein is looking really forensically at the colours found in nature. And this project book, this is obviously only one page of it, but it includes fashion illustrations and model room settings. So even as a young man, as a student, Klein was really thinking about how to integrate his ideas and his passion for colour into everyday life. When Klein graduated, he settled in Galashiels in the Scottish borders, where he would eventually set up his own business. There he drew upon a pool of local expertise to produce really groundbreaking women's wear textiles for the couture and export markets. Now, he was really inspired by modern art from his studies with Ardon at the Basel, but he was also very, very influenced in movements in post-war design reform. And in 1951, he visited the Festival of Britain with Margaret, actually when they were on their honeymoon. So the Festival of Britain, again, this is something that I think has been covered quite a lot during this programme of talks, because it was such a kind of seminal moment in where Britain was trying to position itself in terms of design on the world stage, and also because of the enormous contribution of émigré designers to this event. So the Festival of Britain opened in London's South Bank Centre in 1951, although it had outposts kind of all over the country, and subsequently toured Britain. Its broad aims were, and I quote here from a pamphlet from the exhibition itself, I quote, "a shared exhibition of science, technology and industrial design," end quote. And on the screen here, we have a quote from Bernat himself, again from his autobiography, Eye for Colour. And I think that this really shows the effects that the Festival of Britain had on Bernat and his kind of developing consciousness as a young designer. And I'll just read out because it's a really beautiful quote. He writes, "It was breathtakingly obvious that young Britain was thinking of the future, and the world in which we'd been living in for the past 6 years was going to change, I thought, rapidly. Almost everything at the South Bank, from dustbins to doorknobs, had an element of newness, excitement, or just plain fun. I felt a tremendous urge to be actively a part of this emerging world." So this exhibition really kind of introduced the British public to completely new visual languages and modern design, and we can see from the quote the effects that it had on Bernat Klein. So again, it's impossible to overstate the influence of émigré designers in the planning of this festival and the products actually featured within it. So for example, Tibor Reich, who I'm going to go on to talk about a little bit more later, Hans Tisdall, Jacqueline Groag and Marion Maller all featured products in the Festival of Britain, and designs by Maller and Groag were particularly kind of singled out by the press, and one contemporaneous press article describes their work as, I quote, "a combination of acid colours, bold abstracts and whimsy, in contrast to the more restrained British palette," end quote. So these practitioners were bringing with them really new ideas, and certainly in the case of Bernat Klein and Tibor Reich, Jacqueline Groag and Marion Maller, a real burst of colour, which one can only imagine the effect that this had on the British wartime public in the years following rationing. So Klein launched his own firm, and he called his first firm, Colourcraft Limited, in 1952, the year after he visited the Festival of Britain. The operation was based in Galashiels in the Scottish Borders, and he rented initially a small section of a weaving shed and started his business with a small loan borrowed from a friend. And Bernat Klein's daughter, Shelley, notes that there was a great deal of support for her father in the Borders, and he really benefited from the knowledge and friendship of more established textile manufacturers. The firm's initial sales came in the form of woven headscarves, that very popular wartime accessory, retailed through chain stores, high street stores such as Woolworths, British Home Stores and Marks and Spencers. Marks and Spencers, of course, another really fascinating émigré concern. So during this time, the business expanded really rapidly, and Klein was able to purchase the nearby Netherdale Mill in 1956, significantly increasing the company's capacity for production. At this time, Klein undertook contract weaving for Tibor Reich, his friend and collaborator. Reich was an émigré designer from Hungary and a lifelong friend and creative collaborator of Bernat Klein. As I mentioned before, Tibor Reich also studied at Leeds University, but Tibor established a textile manufacturing business in Stratford upon Avon. And like Klein, Tibor was also that combination of designer and manufacturer. And similarly had a really interesting combination of European modernist education and a kind of real grounding in textile manufacture from his studies at Leeds. Reich was also fascinated by colour and developed his own visual language based on colour values. Now, just as a kind of little footnote, in the mid-1950s, a lot of mills in the Scottish Borders were lying idle due to the recession brought about by the post-Korean War slump, and these young émigré designers brought orders and jobs to the region. So at this point in time, in the mid-1950s, it's fair to say that Bernat Klein's business was doing very well. And he commissioned the modernist architect Peter Wormersley to design the family home High Sunderland, which we can see here. That structure was completed in 1957 So this is a rather lovely image taken by our museum photographer Neil, and I think it shows the house in the context of the landscape. So High Sunderland is a modular grid structure of timber and plate glass, and a lot of the outer covering, I guess you'd say, of the house is plate glass. So it affords these really panoramic views into the Scottish landscape, and one almost gets the sense of kind of the outside coming in, being in that space. And I think there's a really, really interesting relationship between Bernat Klein and modernist architecture. For him, I think it's fair to say that the home was really an extension of his design philosophy and personal identity. And we have a lot of kind of ephemeral objects in the archive that show that the house was like a backdrop for photo shoots, and even catwalk shows took place in the living room on occasion. So the Scottish landscape seen here in the context of the home was really, really important to Bernat Klein in terms of visual inspiration. And the natural world, and more specifically Borders landscape, inspired Bernat Klein's oil painting. And there's this really, really symbiotic relationship between his paintings and textiles, which I've tried to kind of draw out within the exhibition, whereby the paintings really serve as platforms for experimentation with colour, form and texture, and inspiration and forms really kind of flowed quite organically between the two mediums. He was also, as we know, very interested in modern art and colour theory, and these elements also feed into his practice. So on screen we can see a 1964 oil painting entitled Autumn Trees, quite self-explanatory. And on the right, I put up a little kind of close-up detail of the painting. So that shows really that Klein was breaking down images into flat planes of pure colour, which he applied with a palette knife. And this means that the colours shift in relation to the viewer's distance from the canvas to create really luminous colour effects, and this kind of almost like shimmering surface. Klein was very interested in the work of the French chemist Eugène Chevreul, containing colour relationships and the simultaneous contrast of colours, and he was also hugely inspired by post-impressionist art, and in particular the work of Georges Seurat and his pointillism. Now, Klein visited the National Gallery on his 1951 honeymoon at the same year as he visited the Festival of Britain, and saw Seurat's work up close and personal in the National Gallery in London. And this is a quote, again from Eye for Colour, that really describes the effect that Seurat's work had on him and his ideas about colour in relation to textile design. So this idea of pointillism and simultaneous contrast of colours really inspired Klein to create very groundbreaking women's wear textiles. And he achieved this via a process called space dyeing. So basically, space dyeing is a process of resist dip dyeing a yarn, so like a skein or a hank of yarn, of resisting part of that yarn and submerging it into a dye bath, and then resisting another part of the yarn and dipping it into another dye bath. So what this does is it creates separate colours within a single yarn, and then it also creates secondary colours where those two dyes kind of bleed into one another. So when these colours, the multiple colours in a yarn are woven together, the multiple colours, of course, produced by space dyeing, that produces this kind of process, this effect, sorry, of almost controlled randomness. So the colours form in a kind of are dispersed on the canvas of the textile in quite an uneven way, almost like the colours found in nature. And Klein called these very experimental, very exciting new textiles, mohair tweeds. And he used brushed mohair because this fibre takes colour extremely well. It creates really luminous colour effects, and also with mohair it can be brushed to create an illusion of volume, but it's actually incredibly light. And of course it was, I'll go back one, it was Zika and Lida Asher of Asher Limited, the dynamic Czech émigré couple, who first introduced mohair into the couture market in the early 1950s, creating fantastical mohair fabrics for couturiers such as Balenciaga. And actually Vogue credited the Ashers with, well, specifically Zika Asher, as being, and I quote, "the man who introduced the mohair cult," end quote. So in her introduction, Anna mentioned a really phenomenal exhibition of the Asher's work that was held at the Decorative Arts Museum in Prague in 2019. The curators there also produced a really excellent publication. So if anyone would like to know a bit more about the Ashers, I would strongly recommend that book. So Klein was, at this point in time, had offices in London and was pretty international. It was in London that Klein developed friendships and creative partnerships with other émigré designers, and creatives, including the Ashers and the Yudas of the export magazine, The Ambassador. And The Ambassador really championed the work of progressive émigré designers, and Klein's textiles featured in many issues of the publication. He was even awarded the Ambassador Award for Achievement in 1963. So in a bid to promote his innovative fashion textiles, Klein sought a cash injection, basically. And in 1962, the company received the financial backing of Imperial Tobacco, which gave them further capacity to market their products to an international audience. The company was renamed Bernat Klein Limited, and fabrics were sold by agents in Europe and North America. And a really significant breakthrough for the company came when the House of Chanel selected a mohair tweed fabric for their spring-summer 1963 haute couture collection. Other couture houses followed suit, and designers such as Pierre Balmain, Pierre Cardin, Dior, Nina Ricci, Yves Saint Laurent, and Hardy Amos all featured Klein's fabrics really consistently throughout the 1960s. And it's very interesting to read fashion publications from that era, because the journalists really do talk in a lot of detail and very, very knowledgeably about the fabrics. So the kind of mid-1960s was a real heyday for Bernat Klein in terms of his acceptance into the Paris couture world. And it all started with Coco Chanel. But of course, in the context of talking about a designer from the Jewish diaspora and Coco Chanel, I think it would be very disingenuous to leave out some mention of Coco Chanel's widely publicised anti-Semitic views. So Chanel is an incredibly problematic figure in fashion history. She socialised with far-right figures, including the Duke of Westminster and Paul Éribe, financing the latter's political journal Le Témoin, translated from French, it means The Witness, which was extremely right-wing and often featured anti-Semitic cartoons. She also had very well-documented links to the National Socialist Party that are outlined in Hal Vaughan's excellent book, Sleeping with the Enemy, Coco Chanel's Secret War. So, of course, here there is a very notable kind of dichotomy between the House of Chanel purchasing Chanel and Bernat Klein's textiles season after season after season, and giving them this international prominence, and the views and actions of the founder of the house. It is not really possible to overstate how key the fantasy tweeds created by Bernat Klein were to Chanel's post-war comeback, as they were just used so much and so widely publicised in the fashion press. And Bernat Klein himself met many of the couturiers who used this cloth over the years, but he would never meet Chanel personally, and would speculate later in his life that this was in fact due to his Jewish heritage. So at the same time, Klein's fabrics sold extensively to the North American market, to both ready-to-wear and high fashion buyers. And this is a kind of ongoing area of research for me, somewhat complicated by the fact that these fabrics were not sold by the name Bernat Klein, but anonymously through international textile agents. And this coat is by the San Francisco-based firm Liliane, and it uses a Klein textile, as we can see. And I actually purchased this for the National Museum of Scotland collection a few years ago, and I purchased it on Etsy. So I managed to identify the textile as being Bernat Klein and purchase it for the collection, and it's on display in the exhibition at the moment, so it's really lovely, and it supplements our existing collection and enables us to tell that transatlantic fashion history narrative. So in Anna's excellent book, The Clothes on Our Back, she really highlights how many émigré creatives and business people practicing in post-war Britain were much more international in their outlook in comparison to their British counterparts. Many spoke multiple languages, could confidently promote their work in continental Europe and North America. And I think that this is certainly true of Bernat Klein. He is indeed an unusual phenomenon as a textile designer, a named textile designer, retailing under the brand Bernat Klein Limited. As we know, textile design is normally a much more anonymous profession, and clothing will more typically bear the label of the house or designer of garment rather than that of the textile. And the archive really demonstrates the importance of branding and image making and this international outlook to really the broad spectrum of Bernat Klein's diverse output. And here's a lovely example of some branding. Look at that use of the Helvetica font. So parallel to the development of the couture fabrics that I just spoke about, Bernat Klein Limited also launched their own range of hand knitting yarns. They featured, as we can see, Bernat's signature use of colour and texture, and these were sold to home knitters in order to create their own Bernat Klein look at home. So this is where Margaret Klein comes into the story. So Margaret Klein didn't have any formal design training, but she was an extremely skilled hand knitter. And Margaret produced a number of knitting patterns that allowed home knitters to knit their own Bernat Klein creation without the price tag of couture. I should also say that the company was selling fabrics for home dressmakers at this time. So there was essentially kind of three strands to the business in the 1960s. There was the high-end haute couture fabric, the ready-to-wear fabric, and the fabrics for home dressmaking, and of course the hand knitting yarns. So there were different entry points and kind of diversification of the brand. So at arguably the kind of height of his high fashion success, Bernat Klein resigned from his eponymous company over some creative differences with his financial backers and set up a design consultancy business. And he used this opportunity to explore new avenues such as interior design, product design, and colour consultancy. And at this point in time, he commissioned again the architect Peter Wormersley, who designed his home High Sunderland, to commission a purpose-built studio for the company. And this rather lovely object is a leaflet in the archive obviously for Bernat Klein textiles. I wanted to include it because not only does it show this amazing kind of brutalist cantilevered concrete and shuttered glass structure, but it also displays quite succinctly how the architecture was feeding into the wider Klein brand. So we can see here on the top right the inspiration in the landscape, the textile, and how the architecture is kind of playing into that story in quite an interesting way. So during this consultancy phase of his career, Bernat Klein worked with a number of progressive furniture and textile manufacturers in the UK, such as Gila, G-Plan and Margot Fabrics. Indeed, his collaborations with Margot won the 1969 Council of Industrial Design Award, a really leading industry accolade. He also had fabrics featured on the QE2 ocean liner. Very much like with his fashion textiles, many of his designs for interiors took their inspiration from the natural world, and he looked very, very closely at colour relationships. So we can see here on the left of the screen, Bernat Klein design for a rug for Tomkinson's Carpets of Kidderminster, and on the right, the painting that has inspired the rug. So, and the painting, I should say, sorry, is of tulip petals, hence the title. So much like the painting that we looked at earlier, Autumn Trees, sections of pure colour have been applied to a canvas with a palette knife in a configuration that creates this really luminous, dynamic surface, which has been translated into a woven rug to integrate colour and nature into the interior. Bernat Klein at this point in time found particular success in the Scandinavian market, collaborating with furniture and textile manufacturers such as Western Carpets of Sweden and Fiedler Fabrics of Copenhagen. And this was a particularly notable achievement, as in the 1960s and 70s, Scandinavian design was very much considered a leader in its field, and Klein's acceptance within this design community acted as a real major boost to his consultancy brand. And later in his life, Klein would say that the acceptance of his work within the Scandinavian design community was one of the proudest achievements of his career in his own mind. So the late 1960s saw a shift from woven textiles into printed textiles and experimentation with newer, cheaper synthetic fibres. So in the late 1960s, Bernat Klein was invited to design a range of colour schemes and prints for the Leicestershire-based textile manufacturing company, British Encolon. So this was to promote a new line of dress weight jersey fabrics that were made from polyester that retailed under the name Terlenka. So of course, at this point in time, we don't really have the negative connotations that we have today with polyester clothing. And at the time, these products were really lauded for the fact that they took colour so well, hence employing Bernat Klein, and the fact that they were like very easy care, very easy to travel, pull out of a suitcase. They look great. And as part of this drive to promote this new fibre type, British Encolon enlisted Bernat Klein, as he was then a very, very prominent colour consultant. So these screen printed designs were based on the abstract shapes and compositions produced by magnifying little sections of Klein's oil paintings. So you can kind of see that kind of visual relationship there. Although relatively expensive, this new range of printed textiles was intended squarely for the ready-to-wear market. So I think it's very much worth noting the fluidity between Klein's oil paintings and his textile designs has a very strong precedent in the history of 20th century design. So the exhibition, many of you will be familiar with the seminal exhibition, Paintings into Textiles, which was organised by the UDAs of the Ambassador magazine and held at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London in 1953, saw works of fine art being used as inspiration for innovative new textile designs and featured progressive artists such as Henry Moore, Eduardo Pulozzi and Graham Sutherland. Following this initiative, companies such as David Whitehead, Edinburgh Weavers and the aforementioned Asher Limited commissioned prominent artists to design textiles. And interestingly, the relationship between Klein's paintings and textiles was documented quite widely in the fashion press and actually the popular press. And he arguably used his image as an artist designer to promote his eponymous brand. There's a lot of kind of publicity images in the archive that show Bernat wearing an artist's smock and painting on plein air in the grounds of High Sunderland. So there's again quite an interesting relationship there that has a strong historical precedent. So going back to the prints, These print designs formed the basis of a series of mail order ready-to-wear catalogues, the first of which was launched in 1973. The mail order catalogues did very well and subsequently expanded to include hand-knitted garments designed by Margaret Klein in Bernat's signature colourful yarns. Margaret is kind of a bit relegated. She's a little bit overshadowed by Bernat, but essentially Margaret was the head of knitwear design at Bernat Klein Limited. She designed the knitwear patterns, and she also managed an army of outworkers across Scotland to hand knit these garments for the mail order ready to wear section of the business. Always, I mean, we can see here, you know, I spoke about branding before. We can see here how carefully considered the photo shoots were. Everything, I mean, the car is blue, the accessories are blue, everything is blue, everything was kind of arranged according to colour, and the backdrops were extremely carefully thought about. The graphic design, the photography, the branding, the colorization, everything was so carefully considered across all of Bernat Klein's activities, and I think it's very, very evident here. The mail order catalogues also came with pull-out colour selectors, and the idea behind this was that it would allow consumers to coordinate ensembles based on enjoyment of colour. So this guide is intended so that someone, after establishing what colours suit them, can choose different fabrics and different silhouettes and really add pieces season after season to form a capsule wardrobe. So I think it's again, it's not an exaggeration to say that Bernat Klein believed passionately in the psychological power of colour and really wanted to empower consumers to create a wardrobe based on the enjoyment of colour rather than the more transient elements of the fashion industry. Although, of course, he did work within that industry, so there's an interesting tension there. So alongside his ventures into synthetic fibres, print design and ready-to-wear, Bernat Klein also continued with his colour consultancy work. And a real highlight of this period was a big commission for the Department of the Environment to design colour-coordinated guides for interiors for government buildings. So Bernat researched this scheme for a number of years before it was launched in 1971. And the idea was that anyone could, using this colour guide, anyone that worked for the British government could design an interior with this guide. So we can see on the right of the screen, the guide itself, and on the left, this is a kind of a layout for an open plan office. And open plan offices at this point in time were just beginning to be introduced into government buildings. So going back to the guide, on the right, you have a basic carpet colour. And then above it, there are fabrics for polyester stretch fabrics for upholstery. There are woven fabrics for upholstery, accent colours and curtain colours. So if you picked constituent parts from one page of this guide, the idea is that you would create a harmonious working environment that would have psychological benefits for its inhabitants. So really quite progressive stuff for the early 1970s and quite utopian in its thinking and very Bernat Klein. So this, I've unfortunately I'm yet to discover an extant Bernat Klein for the Department of the Environment Interior, but I do know anecdotally that these were used extensively across accommodation for the armed forces in the Ministry of Defence. And this unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, this image, but this is a layout for a living room for an officer in the British Army. Wow. And I think going on, I really always draw upon this quote from Bernat Klein because I think it gets us to the kind of heart of what he was trying to do in his own work and the role that he saw design playing on enhancing human well-being, dignity, and acting as a force for good in society. So this is from his later publication, Design Matters, which was about British industry, education, and design reform, published in 1976. He writes, "Good design defends dignity, just as surely as bad design destroys it. To design means to care about people as individuals, or perhaps it means simply to care." So Bernat Klein's multifaceted legacy, I think, is still felt to this day by people that know him. And again, this is something that I'm trying to bring out in the exhibition and through other activities that I'm organising with the museum. So this is promotional material for a campaign for the Edinburgh-based menswear designer Keston's Spring-Summer 2021 collection, which was inspired by Bernat Klein and his modernist home, High Sunderland. I will just got a little bit of time. I'll quickly show you some images from the exhibition for those of you that won't be able to visit, and finish up by saying a few words about how I've kind of approached the exhibition, just by way of a bit of context. So here we are. This is the spoiler alert. This is the entry point into the exhibition, Bernat Klein Design and Colour, on at the National Museum of Scotland until the 23rd of April. So the show, I've curated it thematically rather than chronologically, and the Klein story unfolds over 5 broad themes, each exploring a different facet of his design practice. So we can see here, although I said it's thematic, not chronological, the show begins with a timeline featuring 3-dimensional objects, including the 1948 Leeds University sketchbook that we discussed previously. The show is also enhanced with some newly commissioned films, one of which explores Klein's work and legacy and has interviews with designers practicing today who have been inspired by him, including Keston and an interview with Tibor's grandson Sam Reich as well, to get that kind of émigré context. We also have another film within the show that looks at architecture and Bernat Klein's collaborations with Peter Wormersley and the importance of landscape on his practice. Alongside the show, we have a number of events on, including one, as Monica mentioned earlier, where Anna's going to come up on Saturday the 4th of March to show her film, Refuge Britain. And we have also, with the Bernat Klein Foundation, just produced this lovely publication that is for sale on the Bernat Klein Foundation's shop online. There's a wee link to it there on the slide. I think that's going to go up on YouTube. So the book is written by multiple authors and kind of explores a lot more of the themes that we've talked about today. And yeah, it has essays by a number of individuals, from historians to design practitioners, and many, many images of objects in the National Museum of Scotland collection, and new work that's been inspired by Bernat Klein and the archive. So I think that's enough for me. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and I think we've got some time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was absolutely brilliant. You, as you said, there was such a lot to say, such a multifaceted person, but I think you really did him justice. And we all got an idea of, the relationship between his art and the fabrics. It was brilliant. I did notice in the chat function there were a couple of questions about books that you mentioned.
Yes.
So if you don't mind, I'm just going to flash up a couple
Okay.
of them. I think you kindly mentioned my book, which is called The Clothes. There you go.
Twinsies.
It's a better one. Clothes on
well
Our
thumbed.
Backs, which is more of including a tiny bit on Bernat, but hardly any. And there's also the fabulous book about the ashes. It's just a joy. Look at the colours. So yeah, do treat yourself. And there's also a lovely book of Tibor Reich as well, isn't there? which is called Cuborite Art of Colour and Texture. And I should be adding to my collection by buying the Bernat Klein one. I got there as well. Okay, enough from me. Over to questions now.
Right, now's your chance,
Monica.
everyone. I don't think I've seen any direct questions yet, so perhaps I can start the ball rolling, because I've got lots of things I'd like to quiz you about, if I may, but I'll keep an eye on the chat as we go along. Starting perhaps at the very beginning of his career, I did know that there was the sort of Israel, the Jerusalem connection, and at, I think it's actually called Bezalel, just for the record, which is actually the name of the craftsman who built the biblical temple, so that's just for the record. But that aside, I mean, Mordechai Ardon is actually a very interesting character. I think he was German born himself and ended up in Palestine. But although I don't know his work intimately, my impression is that he used a kind of quasi-abstract vocabulary, but very much with an emphasis on conveying the spiritual in art, a la Kandinsky. And you mentioned, I think, am I right, that actually Klein himself had begun to train for the rabbinate, or had thought about it, am I right? Or certainly was involved with the religious aspect of Judaism. I'm just very interested to know whether in his later writings, or even unpublished letters, whether there's any evidence of this sort of continuing interest in spirituality, which might act as a kind of interesting counterpart to this very kind of sensual appreciation of color and the physicality of textiles and paint.
To the best of my knowledge, Klein didn't really practice his religion after he moved to the UK. I think he went to temple a few times with his dad when he was in Leeds, when his father managed to go over and join him. But he, for the rest of his life, would identify as an atheist. So I think the things that he took from his childhood into raising his own family were a love of food and eating communally and sharing food as a kind of act of love. That's something I've spoken with Shelley about over the years, and something again that she kind of explores in the See-Through House, of his relationship to his past and his Jewish identity. I think, I don't know if this is a stretch to say, but he almost considered colour and design with a kind of quasi-religious kind of fervour almost. I think design and colour almost were akin to religion for Bernat Klein, in the way that it infiltrated all aspects of his life and was kind of a guiding principle for the way he lived. Like we see publicity images of High Sunderland, of the family home. It always looked like that. It was just so, everything was the environment was so precisely configured, and everything was in such harmony. And yeah, I think almost design and colour fulfilled that gap left by early religious studies. But that's me slightly speculating in
but
that
it's
respect.
kind of there embedded in that last quotation you gave. I mean, it's not saying exactly what you're saying, but this idea that it's not just about design, it's about something much deeper and more pervasive and important. Definitely. In a sense. Yeah, very interesting. I'm still looking. I think there are one or two questions about practicalities, but we'll come back to this perhaps at the end. Picking up on that, wonderful modernist house about which Shelley Klein has written so eloquently, among other things. But I'm curious to know about Peter Womersley, and sort of sidestepping slightly, but did he himself have any sort of, I don't know about him as an architect. Is there a kind of émigré connection in any way in terms of influence or connections with the architect?
No, not so Womersley was a Yorkshireman, and he did actually himself emigrate to Hong Kong later on in his career. But there's in the film that I commissioned for the exhibition, we speak with an architect, Rebecca Wolver, who has done a lot of research into the Peter Womersley private archive and the archive at the RIBA. And Womersley is quite an interesting character in relation to Bernat Klein. They were both extremely fastidious in their approach to their chosen mediums of architecture and textile design. They both, again, Womersley seems to be someone that had this great faith in the power of design but there seemed to be this collaboration, this mutual respect between them. Bernat Klein made some later alterations to High Sunderland with Peter Wormersley's blessing, and apparently this was quite unusual for Peter Wormersley to allow a client to modify the space. And in fact, some of Bernat's textiles, Wormersley commissioned Bernat to create textiles for his own home. So there's this really like interesting kind of creative collaboration and meeting of minds between the two individuals. But no émigré connection, I'm sorry.
No, I just want to, he must have been, I don't want to dwell on that too much, but he must have been aware of the modernist, trend, and
yeah, so
first European and then British.
Yes.
The British.
So actually, one of Wormersley's tutors at Architectural College was Arthur Corn, who was also an alumnus.
Well, he's in. Okay, actually,
Exactly.
I have just apropos that's very interesting, because in fact I've re-encountered somebody recently who's been doing research on Corn, and I'm hatching a plan for a talk on him. So watch this space as they say. Right, now hold on, is this, yes, Celia? Celia, do you want to unmute yourself and talk out loud?
Thank you. It was a great talk. Thank you so much, and it really brought out all the elements and his inspiration. One thing that I'm interested in is the other people who worked in his company and in his design studio. I assume you've mentioned his wife quite a lot, but could you say something about his team of designers that I imagine he had, and how he worked with them, and to what extent he did things himself, or he gave them creative inspiration and let them sort of execute his ideas?
Thank you. That's a very good question, and it's something that, when we're dealing with someone that's so what's the word I'm looking for? Such a kind of powerful force and the face of the brand, it's really easy to forget about the network of professionals behind that to actually make it into a business. So unfortunately, in the archive at National Museum Scotland, we don't really have business records, because the archive came from Bernat Klein himself. He didn't keep those because they weren't meaningful to him, I guess. So we don't have that. So it's almost like a kind of process of like reverse engineering when doing research into this collection, but have managed to track down a number of individuals who worked with him through adverts in the paper and conducted quite a few oral history interviews. Those are on the Bernat Klein Foundation's website. If anyone wants to listen to them, they're super interesting. So the individuals I know of that worked with Klein, most of them trained at Scott College in Galashiels, which is now Heriot-Watt University. So he was able to kind of recruit directly from the textile training college that was literally down the road. In terms of his influence on them, that's a really, really hard question. So one of the I've spoken to a few people that did contract dyeing for Bernat Klein, particularly the very innovative space dyeing with the brushed mohair. And I get the feeling that the brief to those dyers was always very exact. In our introductory film in the exhibition, there's a really lovely anecdote about Bernat coming in with a leaf from a tree and telling the dyers to match it now. It was midday. Don't match it at 5. It'll oxidize. It'll be brown. I want the green. I want it now. So I think he was quite an exacting client. But another dyer I interviewed that worked with him said that he worked as a dyer for Bernat when he was quite a young man, and he said that Bernat was one of his favorite clients because he always challenged them. He always challenged them to do quite hard new things with the space dyeing, and he felt a great sense of pride that the dye work that he had done was on the Paris catwalks and had this kind of international reputation. I don't get the sense from the interviews that I've done that the process was all that collaborative. I think it was collaborative in terms of technical expertise, be that dyeing or weaving, but not in terms of the overarching vision. Yeah.
Lisa, if I can just chip in there, I mean, that sort of prompts me to ask something I was going to ask probably anyway, and that is to what extent he would have, I mean, it's a hard, impossible question really to answer, but, you know, he obviously attached great importance to his painting, which of course is much more self-sufficient and unpractical. Do you think in an ideal world he would have actually gravitated more and more towards that? Was business something that he had to do for actually largely practical reasons, or was it actually more complicated than that?
It was the painting something he had to do for?
No, on the contrary. No, I mean, would he have preferred to be a pure painter?
I don't know. It's hard. It's hard because, like, you don't, as a researcher and a curator, you don't want to like psychoanalyze your subjects, or like assume things. No, I think the fact that he, you know, authored these 2 books about design and the role that it played in society would suggest that he believed that was a very noble end in kind of being an industrial designer and designing for the mass market. And the amount of research and development that went into schemes like the Department of the Environment, so the colour coordinated guide for interiors, it goes into crazy amounts of detail. Like at the back, there's like serial numbers where people could order different things through the government offices. There are schematics of where the light is coming from, as to what colour you should paint a wall, furnishings, if a room is modernist, if it's period. There's just so much thought into how individuals interacted with the products that he designed and manufactured. You know, we can see this with how he like configured his mail order catalogues with those pull-out colour charts. He also, it's something I didn't really have time to go into, but in 1965 he launched a kind of product to help consumers decide what colours would suit them based on the colours of the iris. So no, I don't think like intellectually he would have ever been satisfied with being a painter. And I think there is a super interesting relationship between the 2 mediums, and there's a lot that flows between them, and they both exist as entities in their own right, but kind of, yeah, a lot of things kind of flow between them.
It's a very practical, apropos his own writings. Can you just remind us what's still in print? I mean, are any of his own books still available?
They're out of print, but you can buy them on the Bernat Klein Foundation's website. So the Klein family very generously donated some books to the foundation a few years ago, and we sell them. You can also pick them up on eBay or Amazon, but you should just get them from the foundation.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. And there's also a question about whether the exhibition is going to tour. An obvious question. Is this it, or will it?
I wish. So I've developed it to tour. So it will be available to tour at the end of the year. So I'm currently kind of talking to venues, but if anyone has a museum or a gallery and they'd like to hire it, get in touch with me. But yeah, the dream is for it to tour to the borders, another UK venue, and perhaps tour internationally.
Be in touch if you have any ideas or suitable contacts. Absolutely. I think we should probably begin to draw a close. It's definitely approaching supper time, isn't it? But Anna, I wonder if I could just sort of broaden out the picture. You know, we've mentioned Tibor Reich and the Ushers, and obviously, Lisa, you talked about colour all the time. It's absolutely crucial to what he does. But apart from the cosmopolitanism and the international contacts, you know, the linguistic skills that the émigrés brought with them, presumably colour too, that sort of unashamed, unabashed love of strong colour, that's something that was very un-English, or is that too much of a generalisation, do you think? Anna, maybe you'd like to...
Oh, he talks a lot about the influence of the Hungarian national costumes, doesn't he? And that's the background he came from. His father, you know, was manufacturing those sort of things, so he grew up perhaps like Bernat as well. That there was national costume, and they were very comfortable with colour, and the Brits really noticed it. I'm sure Festival of Britain that Lisa talked about was a showcase for, you know, this post-war explosion of colours. And also interestingly, the synthetics you mentioned, they were really coming to the fore, and they took colour quite well. I liked your point very much. Now we sort of so look down on polyester, but at the time it was incredibly labour saving and exciting. I think it was seen as exciting, and that was a good vehicle for colour as well. So yes, the émigrés are very much associated with wonderful colour, brave colour, and they often were, you know, I think slightly depressed at the British palette of very soft, you know, endless greys and heather colours, you know, wonderful though they can be in context. So the émigrés, Jacqueline Groag as well, brought fantastic colour from Czechoslovakia. Yeah.
She also talked about drawing on national tradition, folk traditions, didn't she?
Yes, yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. She also designed for Chanel. I'm very interested in your point about Chanel's anti-Semitism. You know, but actually she used quite a few Jewish designers. Yeah, took what she wanted, and then yeah, very interesting subject.
Yeah, we've got in the exhibition, we've borrowed a Chanel 1963 spring summer couture suit, the first time that a Bernat Klein textile was used on a Paris catwalk. But I've also chosen to reproduce a quite anti-Semitic cartoon by Paul Arib that was financed by her, and it features Chanel as depicted as Marianne, personification of France. So we've used that image to go a little bit into that in the context of the exhibition, without obviously overshadowing Bernat's amazing creative achievements. But it's been a good, especially for like younger people that aren't really aware of these narratives, it's been a nice starting point for conversations.
Very interesting.
So
Yes.
let's get Chanel cancelled. No, I'm joking.
Yes. Was Bernat Klein's immediate family, his parents that you showed us and his brother, were they all killed in the Holocaust?
Only his mother was. His brother and his father survived, and various other relatives also perished in the camps.
No, that's certainly one of the ironies of the story. Another one that I was going to pick up on is the fact, and indeed I should mention, while I think about it, that there's a very nice talk by Harriet Atkinson on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel precisely on this rather extraordinary fact that there were a disproportionate number of talented, creative former refugees, you know, contributing to the success of the Festival of Britain. But of course, let's not forget, and this again features prominently in the Insiders Outsiders program, is that, you know, only, 11 years earlier, 1940, most of them were put behind barbed wire, not by the Germans, but as refugees, mostly Jewish, to this country as so-called enemy aliens and, you know, potential fifth columnists. So, you know, it is a remarkable thing that actually not that long after there was this extraordinary kind of willing contribution, you know, made to the rebirth, the sort of revival of culture sort of after the war. Indeed. So last chance, does nobody else have anything they'd like to ask or indeed comment on? And we've had some very nice comments coming in, people who had to leave. So yes, maybe it is supper time indeed. Lovely. Well, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I covered most of the things I think I wanted to say. Shelley Klein's book, somebody confirmed that it is actually a very touching read. I think it's informative, but also as the daughter of somebody with a very complicated history and indeed a complicated relationship to her father, it makes a very fascinating read. Yeah, Anna, go.
Just like to bring in a point that you may not know, that Celia Frank's father was also a very successful émigré textile designer. And there's a fantastic talk by Celia on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube. So if you're interested in the subject, I warmly recommend that you watch Celia's talk as well.
Indeed, I meant to mention it earlier, Celia, for
Julius,
not doing Julius. Absolutely good. And you can find, I mean, I'm assuming, yes, I'm pretty sure that, you know, if you simply do a Google search for Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, you'll find it, but it's www.insidersoutsiders.festival.org is the main website, and indeed on the homepage there's another link to the YouTube channel, which though I say it myself, I think is forming a rich repository of, you know, of interesting material and indeed fruit for further research. So yes, and if you'd like to subscribe to our more or less regular newsletters, you can easily do so if you scroll to the bottom of the homepage, the far bottom right. It's very easily done. Lovely. So I think it only remains for me, yes, lots of thanks and appreciative comments coming in. Anna, thanks very much as ever. Lisa, that was a lovely, engaging, eloquent, lovely presentation. Thank you so much indeed. Go to Edinburgh, see the exhibition if you can. Maybe it'll travel, keep us posted. And just wondering, are the films available at all on YouTube or by any other method?
No, because of boring copyright reasons. So yeah, we reproduced a BBC film from 1973 in the film, and we couldn't afford a web license as well. But we are going to be making another film in-house about the archive and exhibition. So and that'll accompany an event we're having at the end of March. I can't remember the exact date. It's on the museum's website. Where we interview Sam Reich, Kirsty McDougall of Dashing Tweeds, and Keston here of Keston. So we're looking at contemporary practitioners that have been inspired by Klein. So that event is online, and we're going to make a new film that we have copyright for and disseminate that online.
Lovely. Well, keep us posted and we'll make sure to mention it.
Thank you.
Our newsletters. Lovely. Well, thank you everybody for being with us, and good night, be well, and hope to see you at future events. And again, Lisa, thank you very much indeed. That was lovely.
Thanks for having me.
All the best. Bye.